The way we design, build, and operate buildings is undergoing a radical transformation. Welcome to ACE IoT Flight Logs. I'm Andrew Rodgers, co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions, and I've spent years immersed in the world of smart building technology. Join me as I learn from the industry's leading innovators, researchers, engineers, technicians, and more, how we can revolutionize the entire life cycle of the built environment. Get ready to take flight and explore the future of how buildings are delivered and operated. Hey folks, Andrew Rodgers here, co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions with another episode of Flight Logs. Today we're going to be talking to Joel Santisteban from Ecosuite. Ecosuite's another open source company in the DER space, and they've been sort of a fellow traveler on the open core business in the OT environment. Roller coaster or train, I'm not sure, depending on which day you ask me. Welcome, Joel.
Absolutely. Andrew, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So tell me, what does Ecosuite do?
Yeah, I'd say in real simple terms, we're a SaaS business. We help businesses manage electricity assets. And we do that through our grid interfacing asset management solution. Many things kind of underneath that, complexities that you can imagine when we're talking to devices and talking to other various data sources our customers deal with. But fundamentally, that's what we do.
And those electricity assets, those are loads, those are sources, those are both?
Yeah, you use the term on the intro here, Andrew. Distributed energy resources, our tech stack supports the full scope of that term. The way we think about it is any asset, any electricity asset, any device that generates, consumes, or stores electricity is in our wheelhouse, and historically we have integrated with. We do have a focus on solar and storage, and in particular sort of larger portfolios. That's really where value is added in quite acute ways, but we cover the full gamut.
Awesome. And Ecosuite is a company or a product or a software?
It is both. It is the company. The inspiration for the name, ecosystem, as far as eco goes, and a suite of applications or digital tools that we offer to that ecosystem. So that's kind of the inspiration for the name, and it does speak to the fact that underneath the broader Ecosuite platform, there are specific tools that certain folks in various functions will leverage. And so it is comprised of kind of, a handful of superpowers, as we like to often refer to it.
Awesome. So some of that's open source, all of it's open source?
No, good question. Not all of it's open source. At the Ecosuite as an application layer is proprietary. But the magic in terms of how we extract, store, and communicate with various data sources, that plumbing is open source. And that's a separate platform that our team founded many years ago, all the way back in 2009, called Solar Network. And that is that's like one pillar, I would say, of two core pillars of kind of what we embrace in sort of open source foundations. So that's like the energy network, edge compute, data communication, command and control, plumbing. Then there is the sort of ontology, the kind of the data taxonomy side, which we are also embracing open standards through a community called Orange Button.
You used a term that we really like, plumbing, and these assets that we're talking about, people are buying these things, DER, smart building technologies, HVAC systems. They're buying them to perform some purpose. And in the past, I think it was, you bought it to do the thing and then you left it alone until it stopped doing the thing. And as we've gotten more and more, technology capable, we want to squeeze more and more value out of these assets. The data coming from them becomes very, very valuable. for end use cases for the asset owner, et cetera. And historically, both of these markets, smart buildings and the industrial or energy, system side DERs, have treated those data streams as these like valuable proprietary things that had to be, handled with white gloves by only the I love this British term, boffins from deep inside the OEM of the application or of the hardware. And it really should be a lot more like plumbing. You buy a commode, like every plumber knows how to install a commode and get the crap out of the bathroom and into the sewer. And that's what we're trying to do with this data. And sometimes the data is literally crap, but that's where these ontology standards you brought up come in, these semantic standards. But it really, I think that's one of the things that we always saw is very common between our companies is this ethos that like, hey, this getting the data out of the assets, like we get it's hard, we get that there's a lot of challenges with it today, but it shouldn't be. And that's why we're committed to using open source, making these tools available that ease that part of the process. It becomes like pipes. Like no one is out there trying to value engineer the pipes out of their building or their development, and they're also not innovating too much on like the makeup of the pipes, right? Like you use the ones that work, and everybody benefits. So I really love this plumbing. We call ourselves data plumbers sometimes. It's one of our little taglines. So I really like that. On this topic of ontologies, Orange Button, tell me a little bit about that. What does Orange Button do?
Absolutely. It's a great community. Businesses in the distributed energy space, the sort of vision, it's been around for a while. I don't know how many years, but we've been contributing to it as a team for about 6 or 7 years now. And I think the fundamental vision is around avoiding this kind of inherent inefficiency associated with like speaking different languages when we're talking about the same thing. And so this goal of kind of, as I like to describe, like commodifying these assets so that we can accelerate, transactional velocity, so that we can, move on to more innovative things than like saying defining what a project, site, or system is and how it is characterized. Those things are fundamental. They're not that interesting, and they should be adopted kind of unanimously so that businesses can add value on top of those semantics, right? And that value, I know you spoke a little bit about this recently, Andrew, but that value will manifest in the ability to sort of bring process and automation on top of those semantics that we all sort of agree on. So that is what Orange Button does. It has spent a lot of time really just going, deep onto what is a project, what are the counterparties associated with that project, the sort of contracts and service providers that we might engage with within these assets, and bringing some industry specific knowledge and experience to answering those questions, and then offering it to the world through products like Ecosuite, and just in general as an open standard to the community.
Yeah, so on these business models, I think Ecosuite and ACE have very similar business models. Ecosuite has the Solar Network open source project that sort of is the underpinning framework for a lot of the work you do and a lot of the applications you provide. ACE, we have Voltron. We build the Aerodrome suite, which is, we also use that suite word there on top of that. And then those applications, vary depending on the kind of client we're interacting with, but they're all sort of based on that same open core. For Ecosuite, how does that open core lower the barriers for your engagement in your industry? Like, what does that do for Ecosuite's business model? What do you see as key commercial value there from being an open core model?
Yeah. I think it's going to vary depending on who's on the other side of the table, but I would point to maybe two. And under this kind of philosophical driver of like just the community oriented nature of building open source being one, and the commercial, you know, the commercial points that feed from that are like this kind of avoided cost of reinventing the wheel and just general cost effectiveness of bringing awesome technology that's extensible with other folks building in different directions that might add to the value of your platform in the future. I think this goes a really long way for customers when I can sit there and say, look, you're a solar company, and we, as from a plumbing perspective, we've integrated with everything under the sun, pun actually not intended, with regard to devices or system configurations, and that's great off the shelf value add for our customer. But hey, if you want to, which you probably are considering exploring battery storage or EV charging infrastructure because you're building in the built environment, we can sit there with confidence and say, oh, we can bring you that technology as well, because there are other community members actually strictly focused on those avenues, right? So that adds a lot of value. It certainly brings a cost competitiveness to the platform where we can leverage that tech and sort of stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. And I think that's really big. The other really, really interesting, I think increasingly important thing that I'm seeing customers actually start to put as almost an explicit requirement, given the pain they've experienced around this, is like people want to own their data. And, a lot of the incumbent models centered around, and I know this exists there's a very, direct analogy in the building management space as there is in the distributed energy and solar space today, which is like the traditional model kind of centered around being the hardware provider, so the physical and the virtual plumbing to bring data to whatever dashboard that they might offer. And it is now becoming a problem, let's say, a big problem in this world of like new ways to leverage that data, be it machine learning or other applications, other markets, grid services I might want to provide or participate in a world where I want to have access to all of those things. Being constrained by what this vendor can do with my data is unacceptable. And so we actually, when we're talking to customers, we sit there and we put that kind of top line. You own your data. This infrastructure is open. There's an avoided risk of vendor lock-in that people are baking into decision making on these types of solutions. Those are two really, really powerful things, is like just community-based development and extensibility, and then and the costs, benefits associated with that, and then data ownership. That's super fundamental these days.
When trying to explain in the operational technology space why open source, I always come back to this choice, right? Giving folks choice. And one of the things we see a lot of, and I'm curious if this is paralleled, I assume it is, but you as an owner of these assets, as someone trying to derive value from these assets, should not be beholden to the capabilities of a particular hardware vendor's ability to deliver all these other applications. And that's what we see happening over and over, is rather than being able to bring in best-in-class solutions, because I think you already highlighted that, like, if you aren't the right people for EV charging, the infrastructure supports bringing the right people in. And in these proprietary models where the data is in an owned platform, what we see is a bunch of mediocre products from that one vendor where it's not their core focus, it's not what they really want to be doing, the market's demanding it, and so instead of opening up and allowing the best in class to play ball, they just offer their own half-heartedly, and then often they kill it a few years in because they realize that, like, it's actually not a good idea to offer products that you don't care about or believe in. And then you have the owner sitting there with a defunct platform, and their data that they never really had access to, they still don't have access to, and now they still have to go find a third third party, partner to deliver the value. Do y'all see that same sort of process play out?
Yeah, absolutely. And you end up with so yeah, either mediocre products or just like this kind of Frankenstein stitched together solution set where a customer is forced to sort of, you know, work across silos to find the kind of medley of platforms that deliver what they're after in a really disconnected way. And just kind of reinforcing that inefficiency that we're all struggling with in general. So yeah, we see that. We think it's unacceptable, especially in a world like distributed energy resources, a broad space with a lot of technical applications and just sort of general business challenges. Like the traditional, let's say, data acquisition system provider and asset management platform solution provider, they're doing just that, right? They're helping companies aggregate basic data, monitor data, and make decisions on sort of portfolio economics and investment decisions or priorities. And so that's one really important thing. But we're evolving, right? And we're trying to drive to this kind of ability to aggregate assets and then take those aggregations and do things with them, like participate in new and upcoming or legacy grid services and markets. And these are things, when I say up and coming and evolving, it's like some of these things don't even exist right now. They're being defined as we speak. So there's this need to really be nimble and agile in the way that we put this tech to work. And it goes without saying that when you're sort of boxed in by a legacy vendor, you're setting yourself up to move slower than your competition. And that's again, it's not acceptable. And increasingly, customers are moving away from that model.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that is a challenge in the buildings industry that's a little different. In the DER world, the people investing in these, some folks are, buying it for their building, et cetera. But in the case of like developers, they're a little more attached to the operational side of the systems versus buildings. The people moving the money on buildings are treating them like financial instruments. And a lot of times, their depth is, an Excel spreadsheet that has nothing to do with there's nothing operational in there except maybe annual utility cost.
Yeah.
So I do feel like y'all have the benefit of a little more attention put on this stuff because it has a lot, there's a lot more impact to the ROI on the project. You mentioned risk management, risk of lock-in. This is sort of an age-old debate. I think in the IT infrastructure world, in the technology world at large, I think it's pretty settled, but it still comes up in OT. Is this cybersecurity, open versus proprietary? And people can point to package repositories having packages uploaded that are have bad actors with some sort of exploit in them as a thing. And I think that that's like potentially a risk if you don't have secure software development practices and you aren't evaluating your packages before you release and that sort of thing. But it's also interesting that like people see that and they say, oh well, that's a risk, and then you have an entire proprietary software ecosystem delivering software and you just can't see any of that stuff. Like there may be exploits in there may be all these things, but no one's finding them because no one has access to the source code. Do you find that argument coming up still, or is that pretty well settled in the DER space?
Definitely not well settled from a customer perspective. So look, from an Ecosuite philosophical perspective, I'm glad we're moving to security because like the three things that I always talk about from an advantage perspective of embracing open source infrastructure is like community, interoperability and extensibility, and then security. And no, the DER industry is got a lot of work to do and a lot of attention to bring to cybersecurity. at large. I mean, we're driving towards what we view as like a digital future for our grid, and that comes with a lot of, you know, implications associated with like how can we rely on this, and how resilient is this to potential threats. So the DER industry certainly does not have this figured out, but couldn't agree more. The thing that I think open source brings is it's you're avoiding. You kind of said this indirectly, but this common phrase of you're avoiding security by obscurity, and just sort of trust me, I'm secure type of mentality by opening the curtain and showing folks, showing the community, showing customers, should they have the knowledge set to check you on this stuff, which certain customers of ours do. In the case of like grid operators and utility companies, they're going to ask a lot of questions. So showing that we're leveraging best practices, and I'm not our cybersecurity guru, so I'll avoid going too deep on it, but like showing that we're leveraging best practices and the way that we communicate with devices and store information and embrace world class practices is important. From your average customer perspective, there very much is still like a complacency. Like they're not, I would say, asking too many deep questions around this. There may be larger enterprises, and there are larger enterprises we engage with that have requirements, basic requirement, data and compliance requirements like GDPR or SOC requirements that we will meet. But beyond that, they're not necessarily looking under the cover. So I think what we'll find is that the onus of meeting these types of requirements so that we can be the industry we want to be is going to fall on OEMs and the way that they collaborate with software providers like Ecosuite to make sure we're delivering something that's actually investment grade from a grid perspective, which is as a high bar.
So we've talked a lot about open source business models in these operational technology spaces. What do you see as the future for open source in these OT spaces? Where's that leading in the solar industry?
Yeah. So I'll maybe talk kind of about two case studies that are kind of active for us right now. There's a lot there with that question though. But one exciting one in terms of open source infrastructure and tools is around, I think fittingly, the topic of the hot topic of the last several years is AI and machine learning. And we're working with Pacific Northwest National Labs, Stony Brook University, an exciting endeavor, which fits right in line with what we do, which is basically building out an app store, a model zoo, as we tend to refer to it as, of machine learning algorithms that we can deploy down to customer assets and have those do different things. Those that might be, for example, the focus of this project at the moment is to predict inverter faults before they happen. And in some cases, we're seeing results of being able to do this weeks before they happen, which has really meaningful applications, as you can imagine, from an O&M cost saving standpoint. And it's only getting better by the minute as we acquire more data, more information in more volume. We're going to be able to do more with these models. The premise and the core open source elements of this project are a fewfold. Number one, it's the models themselves. They will be available once sort of published. They will be available to the world to leverage. But what's really exciting is the framework that is solar network infrastructure we refer to as Solar Quant. This is framework for extracting and normalizing data from heterogeneous devices, offering that to the machine learning data scientists to train their models, and then through the same framework, same plumbing, once those trained models are ready to deploy, actually enabling the publishing of those models down to the edge compute, down to the grid edge, to run in real time and produce a new data stream in the form of a sort of predictor output. All open source. That framework and the models themselves are all open source. And I think this is really big from an asset manager and operational perspective. Customers are going to want to have access to this stuff. And they're going to want to leverage their data to train those, the next sort of generation of models that machine learning scientists are ready to sort of churn on. So that's one really big and I think topical, example. The other one is a little bit broader and probably a little bit further out from a vision and maybe industry readiness standpoint. But this is around some, we are doing some work in Washington, D.C. right now with the local distribution utility. And the premise of this is to aggregate assets on the distribution network, primarily solar, but really all DERs. We're looking at storage and EV chargers as well, to expose the attributes of those DERs, the sort of knobs and dials as we generalize it often, to the utility company so that they can leverage them for grid services. The sort of focus goal is to expand hosting capacity and reduce interconnection timelines. All of that infrastructure and the way we expose those knobs and dials will be delivered open source. This is Solar Network. Specifically, this is a sort of plug-in and a functionality we refer to as a DNP3 outstation. Without going into too many details, this is kind of the starting point for a broader concept that we believe will be kind of the end game for distributed energy, which is something we describe as an energy services interface. And this is kind of the ability to leverage all of the knobs and dials of any grid interfacing asset through kind of a standard language and set of protocols that any utility operator will be able to embrace to ultimately drive reliability in a distributed future. So that is another more, I'd say, vision-oriented project that is fundamentally based on open source efforts.
Well, those are both really exciting projects. I'm really excited about the modeling. I feel like, again, in the OT industry, like somebody will come up with one little analysis and wrap it in a proprietary platform and then treat it like it's secret sauce. And a lot of this stuff is pretty, I wouldn't say like fault detection fault prediction for inverters is trivial, but there's a lot of things that you want to know, a lot of simple analysis, a lot of fault detection, that sort of thing that is pretty straightforward. And because they're wrapped in all these proprietary platforms, it's really hard to spin them up. And so any application, any project where you're taking some of those things and publishing best practices and implementations of best practices, a lot of times you'll find the best practice in a research paper, but then finding an implementation of it or a framework in which you can implement it is really tougher. It ends up wrapped in these proprietary platforms. And you have a friend of ACE IoT's who's a veteran in the smart buildings and HVAC efficiency industry, and we were in a meeting one time and someone was bringing up IP around some analytics, et cetera, and intellectual property. He said, "You can't patent effing physics," and that quote just sticks with me. That's always my when someone comes at me with like an innovation or their new product, and if it's under the hood they're just patenting physics, I'm always a little suspicious. So or maybe it's not that I'm suspicious, like good on them if you can make money at it, but my ethos won't allow me to kind of take advantage of those scenarios. Like
it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable in our view. I mean, I just I get riled up with that. I couldn't agree more. We couldn't agree more. Our ethos is just the exact opposite of that. One, we talked about machine learning models and predicting inverter outages. That's cool and futuristic and whatnot. But just like a very simple thing that the solar industry struggles with still to this day is like basic performance benchmarks. Like I've got some PV modules that are sitting there at a certain tilt in a certain place with a certain amount of irradiance, like what are they doing versus what should they be doing, is still very much a gray area. Like the math underneath that, which is just physics. We just put a piece out on this. Like why is it that expected energy, or like weather adjusted performance, why is it so like mysterious? Why is it that like you have 7 different proprietary platforms that are doing some version of this math in different ways, and it's sort of unbeknownst to us all what exactly that math is? Like, it shouldn't be the case. This is physics. This is literally just basic inputs on the physical configuration of this model of the system, outputting an expected generation number, for example. So we actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because we just put like a thought piece out on this, speaking to this as like kind of shame on the industry, and it is still something we struggle with, like basic performance benchmarks for an industry as mature, granted still young, but as mature as the solar space. We've got to evolve.
Yeah, I've been on this kick lately in the building space around business models on the service side needing to evolve, because right now a lot of times building owners don't have a lot of transparency on what they're paying for when it comes to service. They buy a time and materials contract, service contract. They may know that their belts are going to get changed, but that's about all they know. Belts and filters, and then what? And there's nothing in that contract that guarantees any particular outcome. There's no efficiency benchmarking. There's none of that. And obviously that's got to get fixed and that's got to get resolved. But when you talk to people who maybe have been involved in projects in the past, they kind of say the same thing, that M&V is the hard problem still. And I do see a lot of efforts, open innovation, whether that's in open source or industry associations coming together to, share a framework or an approach, an algorithm, et cetera. But I see that in the smart buildings industry too, that especially on efficiency, there's a lot of community coming together now to help define that benchmarking, because it's so important to justify any of the actual deployments of applications that might provide operational gain. You need to be able to say they did or didn't do that, and be able to quantify it. And the fact that it's so hard, I agree, is ridiculous. One of the things, I'll ask, like, it sounds like you're unfaltering in your position on open source. I feel the same way. I know a lot of people the last few years were giving me a little like, are you sure this is the right way? Like, this isn't, you see these big companies like Elastic and Redis who've got these huge technology platforms that were kind of stalwarts of the open source, environment, turning away from open source. And I think the last 6 or 8 months has really been, venerating. Like that has not worked out well for them. They've lost their ecosystems. They've lost some of the momentum in the market. They're adjusting earnings guidelines. They're putting stuff back into open source again. But I think ultimately the better takeaway from those stories is really about what happened when a company decided they didn't want to play ball, they didn't want to be open. So this could be true for ACE or Ecosuite. If Ecosuite decides next year that you don't want to make Solar Network open source anymore, you want to create a proprietary platform, and that's what you're going to do because it delivers value to your shareholders or whatever. We can talk about why neither one of us would ever do that, but hey, there's externalities, who knows? But the reality is that the folks who deployed that platform just picked it up and went with it. So, Elastic, they abandoned open source. The open source project got launched. Open Search project got launched. Huge community. Almost all the open contributors to the Elastic community moved over to the Open Search community. And Open Search just has continued on. Elastic is re-open sourced, but they're not going to get that community back, which is, I think, the big reason why you wouldn't want to make that change. is the ecosystem is where all the value is. And Redis sort of had a similar thing. There was Redis, they closed source, and immediately the Valkey project launched, and Valkey is kind of the default for a ton of platforms now, and they were releasing features at a speed that Redis couldn't match with their open community because people were excited to contribute to something that was truly open.
I love that statement, though. The ecosystem is where all the value is, right? So when we're, I don't know, this fits, I'd say. I mean, it's like when we get this question a lot, particularly, maybe from, like you said, investors, right? Who will poke at this, like, viewing open source as almost a lack of a moat. I view it the opposite. I view it as almost, it's like it's an open source moat. It is embracing the ecosystem as the value of the platform. It's embracing this vision of, like, products should win. This is something I say a lot. Products should win because they're awesome, not because they are, holding data captive or trying to close source physics or something. It is about network effects. Like, that's, whether or not EcoSuite wins will be on the back of network effects. I know you talk a lot about Metcalfe's law, and this idea of the more nodes added to this system, the more, exponentially more value we're able to create or extract. And that goes, from our perspective, that is also, I think, paralleled to how we think about users and how they contribute value to the platform and the folks within their ecosystem. So yeah, it's a business advantage, and it's a strategy that we embrace. And those examples you mentioned are interesting and certainly worth taking note of as we sort of endeavor through this future, especially in distributed energy, as rapidly as it's evolving, and as many headwinds as there are right now in our particular space. There's an onus on a bigger onus than ever, I'd say, on working smarter and being capital efficient and embracing tools that will help you scale. Open source is going to, I think, have an advantage.
I'll ask you about one thing that's a little bit politically charged, so if you don't feel like you're responding to it, that's fine. But I did read an interesting take that with the reduction in subsidies will be good for the industry because the subsidies were creating fat that was driving poor business models. Do you think there's anything to that? Is that an opportunity for EcoSuite?
100%. That is my position, actually. We look at, I come from sort of the infrastructure, like developer, financier, operator background, and I'm now taking that background and experience and bringing it to the software business. And when we look at at least I've been involved in this industry the last decade, nothing has changed with how we transact and deploy capital. And it is and has been very inefficient. When we think about the cost seg, upwards of 60% of the cost of your average commercial scale project could be soft costs. Right? These are things like waiting in line for interconnection and dealing with the local mayor to get your project permitted and transacting in these really murky tax equity markets that are super complicated and not really accessible for small projects. You have to pay lawyers all these big checks. This has been a bottleneck for our industry for a long time. I think if we lose the subsidies, which we're currently poised to lose right now based on how things are lining up, we're going to be forced to work smarter. We're not going to go anywhere as an industry. Like, we still need power, we still need energy, and we need it fast and cheap, and distributed energies can deliver on that. So we're just going to have to work smarter, and our view is that's what we do. We are trying to help businesses work smarter, avoid reinventing the wheel, transact faster, bring some optimization to the way that we, manage these assets. One thing that I heard at a recent conference that I went to in San Diego, Solar Plaza Asset Management Summit, which is a really fun one, around the context of like the investment tax credit. This, one of the primary subsidies we're poised to lose is, it's in the name, right? It's in what it incentivizes is in the name. It incentivizes investment into these assets. It does not, and has not, sort of driven us forward on like operating more efficiently, or more, or bringing sort of more intelligent practices and benchmarks to the way that we manage assets or get deals done. It just incentivizes throwing cash at these assets so that you can recover them really, really quickly. Now that's a very generalized statement, but there's truth to it, and I think we're going to mature as a market as a result of this. So that's my optimistic spin on the headwinds that we're facing right now. But I think there's a ton of truth to that statement.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that parallels so much what I was saying earlier about the building industry and why it may not move as fast is because, but it sounds like maybe what's held the DER industry back is those same investment models driving that industry for a while. Now maybe that's being pulled away a little bit with some of these subsidies being lost. Well, this is a great conversation, Joel. Thank you so much for coming on. I know we've been talking off and on with Ecosuite for about as long as we've been in business. So it's been, y'all been a great thought partner talking through some of these topics over the years. And we really appreciate y'all. And yeah, it's just great to hear y'all doing so well. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, really just want to reciprocate what you said. It's been a pleasure having you all as sort of a thought partner, and, on the open source kind of hustle alongside us, granted in sort of different spaces. So thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.